Next up, we have someone I met at the first Purple Team Summit. As you can see, this is like a going trend here. Tim was a co-speaker. He was speaking, I was speaking. We met over there in between the tornado alarms and all that fun stuff that was going on in that first summit. It was successful. It was great. But you were at MITRE back then. You were working with the adversary emulation side there, and we were talking, and now you work with us at SITE. So very happy to have you on the team. If you didn't know, I work at SITE, and now Tim does as well. He's the adversary emulation lead, and we help lots of customers not only do their first purple team exercise and kind of get into purple teaming, right? Which you all obviously are into, but then what happens next, right? It's like, yeah, you did one exercise. All right. Everyone goes home and that's it. We forget about it. No, that's not what happens. So Tim is going to talk about the purple team maturity model that we've been working on and building here with our customers and with all of you. Always happy to hear feedback and how you are doing purple teaming. That's why we're here. That's why we're doing this. So without further ado, Mr. Tim Schultz, adversary emulation lead at SITE and ex-MITRE and ex-Sandia National Labs, please take it away.
Well, George, thanks so much for that introduction. So with that, I think he's already taken care of my first slide for me. And just to recap, this is sort of a proposed model based on what we've seen when interacting with a lot of customers and with people that are doing purple team exercises, because there's oftentimes the question afterward. It's like everyone's really excited about this momentum with purple teaming, and what do we do next? And so that's where the purple maturity model comes in. So the roadmap that I'm going to take you all on, this post-lunch slot. So, we're not going to deep dive too much in this, but we're going to sort of bring it back up to a higher level and sort of, a more philosophical level with purple teaming to say, where do we go from here? And so the first thing I always like to set when I'm doing these kind of talks is to talk about why. And the question I want to answer here is, why does purple need a maturity model? So, there's all these different maturity models that are out there within information security. And so the question might naturally come up, why does purple need one? So first, we're going to tackle that to get that right out of the way. Then we'll go ahead and introduce the maturity model itself to answer the what is the maturity model. And then at the very end, we're going to walk through an example, a fictitious company that is going to use their current team, and they're going to build a purple team, and they're going to use the purple maturity model. So hopefully by the end of this, you'll understand why we are looking at purple as a maturity model instead of sort of an exercise, and then what it is and how we can use it. So with that, we'll dive right in. So answering the why does a purple need a maturity model? I first want to take us a little bit into where we are right now. And so with that, we have three different distinct teams that normally, depending on the size of your organization, these may all be a few people, or these may be completely separate departments that have different chains of command, and they all may report to different managers and people within the company. And so what this has led us to is that a lot of these teams have developed capability, they've developed maturity independently from one another. And so this is because of the sort of siloed nature of a lot of these teams that they are focused on themselves in the business context. And so the blue teams are often focused on, okay, how do we do alerting? Do we need to build out firewall exceptions, right? How are we going to administer the machines? And again, that can be broken out into more teams depending on how large your organization is. But overall, the focus has been purely on the defense of the organization. When we move over to red teams are sort of in their own silo. They are building cool attacks, and they're trying to come up with the latest and greatest bypasses to our new defensive technologies and EDR. and trying to figure out how do I get past this and continue to level up so I can continue to, you know, have a good report at the end that shows, hey, we were able to get past everything. So it's great. And then we have cyber threat intelligence, which is a relatively new player that has sort of provided context to each of these groups. And so when we talk about purple teaming, we oftentimes talk about these three areas of expertise coming together. And that's where you see this really big return on investment. We've heard talks, we're going to continue to hear talks throughout the summit that sort of highlight where all of the greatness of purple teaming is. And so the challenge here is, you know, as George and I mentioned at the beginning, what do we do after? And so that's where, you know, my proposal here is that the next step is to create purple teams as their own team. It is no longer a verb as just a purple team exercise, or we come together either, you know, weekly, quarterly, something like that to do a purple team exercise, but we would create a purple team. And so the challenge here is that in some of our purple team exercises, the reason we see such a high return on investment when it comes down to it is communication. And so this communication, this transparency between teams is something that's super critical. And the challenge with all of the different silos is that communication is optional. It doesn't have to happen. Maybe there's some organizational politics that are preventing it from happening. And so overall, everyone is focused on their line of what they're supposed to be doing. They aren't thinking about the whole picture. And that's what a purple team as a noun, as its own separate team would be meant to address. And so part of this is we want to develop a single team that's going to have joint capability, and they are going to tackle some of these challenges that we have seen in the current landscape because we cannot afford to stay siloed anymore. I mean, unfortunately, we see in the news just all the time about how security measures have failed or they didn't work, and part of it is that we have organizations aren't preparing themselves for the current threat landscape. And so how have we solved this? We've solved this before with these singular events and exercises that we've called purple teaming. And I think bridging it beyond that into a mechanism that people can build an entire organizational capability around is what's going to help address some of these challenges. And so that's why I would say that purple teams, their overall goal has been fundamentally different in the mentality than red and blue teams. And so that is why, and that's my answer to the question, why do we need a purple maturity model? Because in these previous sort of breakouts of teams, the red team and the blue team, and hoping that we're going to get some overlap or drive it through these purple team activities, that's been great, but it hasn't been working. And so that's where we need to make this a maturity model. We need to make a purple team something that is sort of the foundational way of people building teams so that they can take all of those intricacies and include them in the team from the start. So now that we've addressed the why, we're going to move on to what is the maturity model. And so again, going back to the sort of purple story, we have the red team, we have the blue team. They've been operating potentially, you know, adversarial is something that's often a common history between them. And then we have cyber threat intelligence. That's again, sort of this newer player that is coming in, providing context specific to adversaries and things like that, both to the blue and red team. And so combining all of those expertise together into this blended exercise we call purple teaming. But if we're looking in my scenario past that, where we're starting with purple teaming, how do we go from there? And so how do we measure a purple team as it's growing, as we're trying to build it? And I've split this out into two separate categories. So the categories are threat understanding and detection understanding. So if you have a red team background, you might easily see yourself within the threat understanding, same with sort of the blue team working in the detection understanding. But overall, these are sort of the two main categories that we're going to be working with to understand how can we continue to build out this team, and then how can we identify gaps in our team when it comes to understanding the threats and our security posture within our organization. So this is where detection understanding, the key questions behind it, are going to be, what is the situational awareness that you're able to achieve by looking at your network and what assets you have and trying to control all of those things. And so we've got a couple of sort of deeper dive questions here. And you'll notice when we go and look at threat understanding as well, that we're going to have some overlap between these. And that's intentional because these teams, while you may develop capability independently right now, overall, trying to merge it together is really what's going to make a really strong purple team. And so the same with threat understanding. The main questions you're trying to answer here are, what are we testing against? What are our adversaries doing? And that's trying to understand and make sure that you are building tests that are going to be working towards a specific adversary. And so after we've identified these two categories to put the maturity part in the purple maturity model, we have a 3-level system that I'm going to walk through. And so the first level I've got here is deployment. Deployment is where most teams are going to start their journey, regardless of whether it's on threat understanding or detection understanding. They're deploying tools that someone else built. And so these tools might include vendor tools. They might include open source projects like Atomic Red Team, or indicators of compromise released by a specific government agency or threat feed. And that's that's just bringing in other people's tools and seeing if you can do something with that. And so does it make it useful? And so past that, we are going to move into integration. And so this is building on top of the deployment. And so integration is pairing tools and resources together to achieve a greater result. And this is something, I don't have any MITRE ATT&CK slides, but this is where I'll point out MITRE ATT&CK, providing the context around, cyber threat intelligence professionals bringing in, whether it's their threat modeling or very specific to the business, like threats that are targeting them. This is where integration is key, because you want to integrate things and achieve a greater result to address shortcomings or gaps that you have within your team. And that CTI is going to provide some of that context that's going to allow integration to happen, or integration points to be identified. So this isn't always addressing something new. It also can be putting two different tools together that you already have to make it easier. So now you don't need two people to look at it or a single person to look at multiple dashboards. You can all look at it under one single interface. And so our final level is creation. And so creation is the final level because you're adding novel tools on top of your integrated and deployed, technology stack. And so when you are able to create something, it is the final level because it shows an understanding of a tool, process, or technique to the point that you are able to apply it to a new use case, which is going to significantly help you when you're trying to adapt to changing threats. So that's something that has always been a challenge in this field, is that as the threats change, we need to be able to measure whether teams can adapt with them. And so that's what creation is meant to show. And so to further reinforce these 3 levels of maturity, I've got 2 examples that I want to walk everyone through that you might be familiar with. So the first one, I picked 2 open source projects that I thought most folks would be familiar with, at least at some level. And one of them, Sigma, and then we have Atomic Red Team. And so Atomic Red Team, I know has been mentioned a few times already. And so it's a very popular framework, and Sigma is sort of a standardized vendor agnostic way of building detections out. And so when we're looking at detection understanding, that initial deployment is like deploying your EDR, deploying your SIM, and seeing what do I get with what I have. And then from there, if you want to build on integration, that's integrating things like Sigma into your greater environment, as well as if you are running like sandbox testing, things like that, trying to build additional tools in to determine whether something is malicious or not. And then, of course, at the very end is developing new Sigma rules that are specific to your organization, potentially contributing back to it. And that's that's what's sort of the key here, is that you're able to measure, this is with a specific tool, but you're able to measure how your team is doing with this model. Now, moving to atomic red team. So deploying and running atomic red team, as has been shown in a couple of these other presentations, is great. And so using that initially to test detections. Where do we go from here for integration? So this is where give the folks at Splunk a shout out for attack range and integrating atomic red team into your detection pipeline and development process. So to make sure, like this can work in two ways, where you either have atomic red team running on the new detections you're trying to build to understand what the interactions are, or it can be used as a checklist to make sure that all of the detections you've developed ever are still working as intended, because you're going to have expected results from those. And then, of course, at the end, creation. You're developing new atomic red team techniques. To highlight a couple of different threat reports here, this is where certain adversaries are going to use, they're going to use different flags when they're running commands, things like that. Understanding how those are going to be targeted to your organization specifically in your industry, depending on the threat groups. This is where developing those new atomic red team techniques is going to be really important. And so this is a quick example of two different things that, two different tools that can be applied to this maturity model in each way. So the underlying assumption between all of this is communication. I've outlined, Sigma rules following the detection understanding, and then atomic red team following the threat understanding. But the underlying foundation to all of this is communication. I mentioned at the beginning, communication being optional is part of the reason that we're having so many challenges today. And so even though I've outlined these two different paths, communication is what sort of weaves them together and brings them together. And that's what we have when we come to our purple teaming. And so I want to highlight that this is sort of our levels 1, 2, and 3. And then we have our detection and threat understanding. So when we look at the model together in a little bit nicer, a square to show how do we chart our path through here. And so this is just the 3x3 shows, can you, bottom left is where you're starting. This is where most teams are going to start. And then you're trying to achieve all the way up to the top right. And so your team may not always start at the bottom left. You may have a really good understanding of detections and you're building detections, but you're building them in a vacuum. And so that would put you all the way, you'll see we have a bluer color here at the top left. And so part of that is being able to map where you are. If you're building detections in a vacuum without testing them, or without understanding their context and how threats are targeting you, then that's going to be a gap. And so there's no one way or right way to go through this, but it allows teams to chart. Again, if you're on the threat understanding side and you have a really mature red team, but you don't understand how to build detections as well as you should, that's where this should be addressed. And so when you're looking and charting from an organization standpoint and from a team standpoint, you want to have a nice balance, because building out a threat understanding without detection understanding is going to leave massive gaps. So this is going to show teams where they have gaps and how to potentially address it with either tools, new technologies, or hiring new people, or for instance, going to a training. And with that, we have answered our what is the model. And so now we're going to go into our final use case. How can we use it? And so this is an example. My fictitious company is named Unicorn Inc. And so we have 3 different people that we're going to talk to. And so this is Alex is our person with a blue team background. Brooke is our person with a red team background. And then Casey is our unicorn with cyber threat intelligence background. And so the way Unicorn Inc. has chosen to go about implementing the purple team maturity model is that they have designated each of these people to come and be the new purple team. And so they're to study the purple team maturity model and then implement it. And so just to give you a little background on their roles before this, was Alex. We're starting with Alex in the blue team background. So Alex has been building new detections based on the latest indicators of compromise from Casey, who's our cyber threat intelligence, emails, which is great. It means that there's already some collaboration happening. And I think this mirrors probably what a lot of security operations centers are seeing. There is some interaction between CTI and blue team. And then we have Brooke, who's our red teamer, who is very active on the red team Twitter community, uses the latest and greatest red team tooling and EDR bypasses from Twitter. And so tries to stay on their game as much as possible. And then we have Casey, who's our cyber threat intelligence professional, who reads every CTI vendor's threat report, makes sure that understands the entire information on security landscape, and as we showed before, sends those indicators of compromise up to Alex. So they've been told you need to implement and build this roadmap. So even though they've now been anointed, they're all purple teaming, the question comes, where are we? Where are we in this model? And so this is where this is going to depend on each team and sort of taking stock of what are the skills that we have available to us and what can we do. And so this is where it's potentially going to be some hard conversations within your organization. But overall, when we're talking about Unicorns Inc., Alex and Casey have mostly been deploying indicators of compromise. So they're probably closer to the level 1 and just deployment on that aspect. Brooke has been integrating a couple of different tools together. As I mentioned, Brooke has been very active on the Twitter red team groups. And so that might be 2-2, an integration. And so from here, the team needs to chart where do we go next? And part of that lack of understanding is that they need more detection understanding. They need more context around it. And so to address this, they've reassessed their roles to try and figure out how to better move towards a balanced and strong purple team. And so that's where now Alex, again, blue team background, is running new detections by Brooke, who's our red teamer previously, to ensure that they work and they're not easily bypassed. And incorporates new detections from new threat reports that Casey, our cyber threat intelligence background, is sending over. And then again, is researching new integration points, because that's where moving from deployment to integration, that is a key part. How do we speed up our analysis process? How do we look for places where we can have higher impact? And then Brooke is, instead of just building the latest and greatest, EDR bypass, is going to build tests that validate the detections that are happening. Alex is sending over detections. Brooke's going to make sure that there's a test to validate that actually works as intended. And from there, they're also going to work with Casey. And so they're getting some new information from cyber threat intelligence feeds and what types of actions and tools threats are doing. And so Brooke can work on building those out. And then instead of just using the latest and greatest techniques, passing them to both Alex for either building detections or throwing them over to Casey and saying, here's a new technique I saw. Are there any adversaries that are targeting our industry, the unicorn industry specifically, in order that we should be testing against? And so our final role here is, of course, Casey, who we've already highlighted a little bit because there's so much integration here. But the focus here is that Casey is going to be researching attackers that are targeting the unicorn industry. So while it's been great that there's this really this greater look at all of the different types of cyber threat intel across the entire industry, focusing on who is targeting unicorns is going to be key to providing the information that's necessary to tackling what's needed right now to both Alex and Brooke. And so that's where providing those reports and guidance to make sure that they are building and testing detections against the latest techniques is really important. And so, of course, then grouping the malware clusters together to make sure that any variants or new groups that are popping up are understood, and that variance with what they're currently testing is really important. And so that's where there's sort of this research or component to every single role that also needs to happen. And so from there, you can see how the team could, again, start building and weaving their way up into the top right of our square here, and that is going to make them an advanced purple team. And so overall, this is how you can chart as an organization, chart your way through this purple team maturity model to understand how do we put this team together, and then how do we measure them as they continue to build and mature? Because the model is meant to be applied to teams, not necessarily just tools. So it can also apply to tools, techniques, things like that. But I think overall, measuring the team's effectiveness is really what matters here. And with that, I think I have answered all 3 of my questions. And I'd like to thank you all for attending and listening to my talk on the purple maturity model. So I will be in Slack to answer some additional questions. And I think, if George, if you've got any questions for me, let's hear it.
Awesome. Thank you for your talk, Tim. That was great. There's a number of questions here. Now let me find them. Someone didn't really understand why unicorns. So I think that's the easy answer. Can you tell them why unicorns?
So Scythe's main logo and mascot is unicorns. And so as you see with George's shirt there. So it's an easy way to sort of showcase the different teams, and makes it a little bit more interesting than the standard stock photos I would have used instead.
Awesome. So one of the things I guess a lot of people didn't really see, or they were commenting on, right, is CTI, right? Like CTI, we've always said, purple teaming is CTI, cyber threat intelligence, red team, and blue team, right? And I think some people think that CTI, I guess, is part of blue as well, but that was a good call out there. I think we should call it out a little bit more. The question someone got is, what happens if, because of course, a lot of what we do is with larger enterprise that have, dedicated blue teams, dedicated CTI, dedicated red teams. What about companies that don't have it? Maybe any of these, or maybe only one as a dedicated? How would you do it for them? Or how would more of a, I guess, small, medium, maybe enterprise, but not that mature enterprise, how would they apply this?
So that's where, to address both of those questions. So one, on the cyber threat intelligence portion, that understanding and context behind each is where CTI really comes in and sort of plays. And so that's why I chose the words understanding, because just emulating threats or emulating adversary behavior is not enough. And so to then move on to how would a team that has a smaller team tackle this? Well, I would say, honestly, I think that the purple team is the model for those small companies moving forward, because the challenge is, if you are deploying a bunch of detections that you're not sure what they do, you're not sure what the expected result is, I think that deploying less detections that you understand, you have a better understanding of what's going to happen, whether it's been validated, and that the detection is linked to adversaries that are targeting your organization or your domain. I think that is the stronger team. So I'm sure we could, that will be a topic for hot discussion. But I think that overall, having less detections and knowing what to do with those detections you have is probably is going to be better for a smaller team than having a ton that you don't understand why things are going off.
Yeah, awesome. And I see Eric is on. The next question I think might be good for Eric, because he teaches 599 and 699, and a lot of what we've been talking about today has been around detection and response, not so much about prevention, right? So how does prevention kind of fit into purple teaming? Probably, I don't know, Eric, if you want to take that, because I know 599 goes a little bit more into prevention and 699 more into detection. One kind of comes first, but I'll let you answer.
Yeah, I can give it a go. That's nice. Thanks. I was just expecting to be nice and easy here, so but there you go. No, I think it's actually a very interesting one, and what I like to say in 599 and 699 is that I feel the whole purple should be the well purple. Miter attack, if you will, and the way that we describe techniques used by adversaries, we should find our common language there, right? And I think this is it's amazing. I think what Timothy has been saying, or Tim, and what most people have been saying is very much so for threat intel, for detections, and for red teamers. But the other side of that, to me, is also the defenders, being the persons who actually build the group policies, who think about hardening of systems, and that's where you see that a lot of the time this is still very much focused on compliance or on specific standards, which make a lot of sense. Don't get me wrong, but if you can then add there your mapping to actual techniques, so you know we implement this control because of that technique, then you're at a really nice level, because then you can actually make what I like to call a nice view on your coverage, but you can add a prevention layer, a detection layer, and that's pretty sweet. So you can immediately spot the big ones where you say, okay, here we also don't have a control. That's what I would say.
Awesome. Anything to add there, Tim?
No, I think Eric sort of nailed that. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Tim, for that presentation. And again, all of you, Tim will be on the Slack channel to answer all your questions, and you'll have fun scrolling up there. I tried to do live tweeting like you've been doing all day, Tim, and halfway through I just failed. But I did put like the first half of it. So thank you for live tweeting. I think a lot of people appreciate that. And oh my gosh, it's more work than I thought. But thank you again.
Thanks all.